In the quiet suburbs of Milford, a town so ordinary it could have been copied and pasted from 1,000 others, a boy named Ethan Ward learned early what it meant to be invisible, until the day his peers decided it was easier to make him a target. He was lanky, his glasses perpetually sliding down his nose, and his clothes often secondhand. He didn't have the sharp comebacks or the easy charm that earned others a shield against cruelty. What he did have was silence, a silence that made the jeers echo louder, the whispers sting sharper. High school hallways became a theater of humiliation. Every day, his footsteps seemed choreographed to dodge sneers and laughter. He remembered the locker incident most clearly, the way a group of boys cornered him, forced him inside, and left him there for hours. By the time a janitor finally freed him, his classmates had already filmed and shared the ordeal. He became the punchline of the year, his name spat out like a joke. Teachers offered perfunctory words of sympathy, but nothing changed. For Ethan, the walls of Milford High weren't just plaster and paint, they were the bars of a cage. What no one noticed was that humiliation, while breaking him in places, also lit a strange kind of fire. Ethan began staying up late at night, his computer screen glowing long after everyone else slept. Numbers, codes, and patterns became his allies. He devoured books on economics, programming, and psychology, anything that taught him how the world worked and, more importantly, how people worked. His grades shot up quietly, though no one seemed to care. But in that invisibility, he found freedom. No one was watching, which meant no one saw him sharpening his mind into something formidable. By graduation, his classmates celebrated freedom with parties, beer, and yearbooks filled with empty promises of staying in touch. Ethan, however, had one plan: never look back. He left Milford with a single suitcase, a laptop, and a resolve as unyielding as iron. He lived in cramped apartments, took jobs no one else wanted, and coded at night until his fingers cramped. Every rejection letter from investors and employers was pinned on his wall like a trophy. Each one whispered the same reminder: "You are not enough." And each time, he whispered back, "Watch me." Years slipped by in a blur of exhaustion and obsession. His first startup failed spectacularly, leaving him with debt and humiliation that reminded him of high school, only sharper. But Ethan had grown used to being knocked down. He had also grown used to getting up. The second startup was different. It was built not on desperation, but on strategy. He had studied markets, understood human habits, and spotted opportunities others ignored. His software, a platform that streamlined logistics for small businesses, caught fire. Investors who once dismissed him now fought for a seat at his table. Money began to pour in, more than he had ever imagined, but Ethan didn't measure his success in dollars. He measured it in silence. Each time he looked at his bank account, he remembered the laughter echoing in those hallways, the sound of a locker slamming shut. He was no longer the boy trapped inside. He was the one holding the keys. By the time he was 32, Ethan Ward was no longer invisible. He was a billionaire, a name that appeared in glossy magazines, his face on the cover of financial journals. He built skyscrapers where others saw empty lots, invested in technology that reshaped industries, and lived in homes that looked like palaces. But what made the story twist, what made it more than just another tale of riches, was what came next. Milford had changed little over the years. The high school still stood, its walls peeling but its hallways echoing with the same cruelty. Ethan returned one spring afternoon, not with bitterness painted on his face, but with a smile so polished it unnerved those who remembered him. He had come not as a victim, but as the town's savior. The school board, desperate for funding, had no choice but to welcome him. Ethan offered millions to rebuild the school, to create state-of-the-art labs and scholarships. But there was a condition: the auditorium would bear his name. The very stage where he had once been mocked during a talent show now held golden letters spelling out the Ethan Ward Center for Excellence. Students walked beneath his name every day, a reminder carved in steel and stone that the boy they once laughed at had rewritten the story. And as fate would have it, some of his former tormentors were still in town. A few had never left, stuck in small jobs and smaller lives. They approached him at fundraisers, their voices coated with false familiarity, calling him old friend. He shook their hands with grace, his smile unreadable. He never reminded them of lockers or laughter. He didn't need to. The weight of his presence was reminder enough. The greatest revenge, Ethan realized, wasn't in tearing anyone down. It was in rising so high that their cruelty looked trivial against the backdrop of his success. Yet, when he sat alone at night in his glass-walled penthouse, overlooking the city that pulsed with his influence, he often thought back to that boy in the hallway, the one who carried books against his chest like a shield. That boy had been broken and humiliated, but he had also been the foundation. Without him, there would be no empire. Ethan Ward, the billionaire who turned high school humiliation into a fortune, understood one truth better than anyone. Some scars don't fade, but if you learn to build on them, they can turn into the strongest steel. Ethan's wealth grew at a speed that stunned even him, but money was only half of the revenge. He remembered faces. He remembered names. Every jeer, every shove in the hallway, every cruel word that had burned into him during those years. They weren't forgotten. He carried them like files neatly stored in the back of his mind, waiting to be pulled out when the time was right. There was Jason Cole, the golden boy of Milford High. Quarterback, prom king, the one who shoved Ethan into lockers and once orchestrated the cruel prank of spreading a fake rumor that Ethan had written a love letter to a teacher. Jason had laughed the loudest when Ethan became the joke of the school. Years later, Ethan found him, working as a used car salesman, his charm reduced to greasy smiles and desperate pitches. Ethan didn't confront him directly. Instead, he quietly bought the entire dealership chain Jason worked for. Within months, restructuring left Jason jobless. When Jason reached out, begging for a meeting, Ethan granted it. Sitting across from him in a glass-walled office high above the city, Jason didn't recognize him at first. But when he did, his face fell, his voice stammering. Ethan listened politely, his expression unreadable, before finally speaking. "You once told me I'd never amount to anything. You were wrong. But you were right about one thing. You'll always be what you are." He left Jason in that room, speechless, a mirror of the humiliation Ethan once endured. Then there was Melissa Grant, the girl who had pretended to befriend him, only to mock him publicly during homecoming week by reading aloud a private note he'd written, exposing his loneliness to an auditorium full of laughter. Melissa had gone on to chase a modeling career that fizzled out. By the time Ethan found her, she was back in Milford, running a small boutique, struggling to keep it afloat. Ethan arrived as a silent investor, offering her a lucrative buyout. Desperate, she accepted, believing she'd finally catch her break. She didn't know until the paperwork was signed who she had sold it to. When she realized, her face paled. Ethan didn't gloat. He simply handed her a check and said, "You taught me what it feels like to be exposed in front of a crowd. I suppose it's fair I return the lesson in a quieter way." And then there was Coach Turner, the man who had stood by while Ethan was bullied, offering only the hollow advice to toughen up. He had been the voice of authority, the one who could have protected him, but instead became another source of humiliation, laughing along with the athletes when they mocked Ethan. Years later, Turner applied for a grant from the Ethan Ward Foundation, unaware who controlled it. When his proposal landed on Ethan's desk, Ethan denied it, not out of spite, but with a letter attached. Children deserve mentors who see strength in them, even when no one else does. I hope you've learned that lesson. I had to learn it alone. The school board, however, received millions from Ethan for new labs, scholarships, and renovations. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who had been dismissed as nothing was now their savior, his name etched on every wall, his influence unavoidable. Parents whispered his story to their children as a lesson: never underestimate the quiet ones. Yet Ethan's revenge wasn't fueled entirely by cruelty. For those who had shown him kindness, rare teachers, a librarian who let him stay late to study, an elderly neighbor who once told him he was meant for more, he gave freely. Scholarships bore their names. Buildings were dedicated in their honor. Where humiliation had once taught him bitterness, kindness had taught him memory. But the sweetest moment came years later, at a reunion he had sworn he'd never attend. Curiosity brought him there, and when he arrived in his tailored suit, stepping out of a sleek car, the air shifted. Conversations halted. Faces turned. People whispered his name as though it were legend. The boy they had mocked had returned as a man they could never equal. When the microphone was passed for speeches, Jason, Melissa, and others tried to mask their unease with forced smiles. Ethan took the stage, his voice steady. In high school, I thought humiliation would define me forever. But I learned something important. It's not the cruelty that defines you, it's what you build from it. Every laugh, every shove, every word thrown at me became bricks. And from those bricks, I built an empire. The room fell silent, the kind of silence that weighed heavier than any applause. For the first time, they saw not the boy they had broken, but the man they had unknowingly created. Ethan walked off the stage, the echo of his footsteps not of humiliation, but of triumph. His revenge was complete, not because he had destroyed them, but because he had risen beyond their reach. Ethan Ward never forgot Milford High. He could have erased the memory, buried it beneath the billions he earned, but some scars cling too deep to be ignored. Success was his shield, but revenge, slow, deliberate, and precise, was the sword he sharpened quietly, year after year. The day his net worth crossed $1 billion, Ethan stood on the balcony of his penthouse, looking down at the city like a king surveying his kingdom. Neon lights reflected in the glass, but his mind was far away, in those dim hallways where his laughter had been stolen. He told himself he didn't need revenge. He told himself success was enough. But deep inside, he knew they needed to see him. They needed to feel what he had felt. He began to move like a chess master. Jason Cole, the high school quarterback, had always been the embodiment of cruelty. He once led the chant, Ward the Weirdo, during a pep rally, the entire gym shaking with laughter as Ethan stood frozen in humiliation. Jason's golden years ended shortly after graduation. No college draft, no glory, just small-town mediocrity. When Ethan discovered him working as a car salesman, he didn't attack directly. He bought the dealership chain quietly, then orchestrated layoffs under corporate restructuring. Jason's job was gone overnight. Weeks later, Jason came begging for a position in Ethan's company. Ethan allowed him an interview. Jason walked into the gleaming skyscraper, his cheap suit clashing against the marble floor, his false confidence dissolving when he saw who sat across the desk. "You," Jason whispered. "Me," Ethan replied, his voice calm, deliberate. "Funny how the world works, isn't it?" Jason stammered through rehearsed words about turning a new leaf and respect, but Ethan leaned forward, his eyes cutting through him. "You once locked me in a cage. Do you know what that taught me?" Jason swallowed hard, silent. "It taught me patience. Now I'm the one with the keys." He ended the interview with a handshake that felt more like a sentence. Jason never heard from the company again. Melissa Grant's betrayal had been more intimate. In Ethan's sophomore year, when loneliness weighed heavy, he confided in her. She listened, pretended to understand, even encouraged him to write down his feelings. He wrote her a letter, a clumsy, heartfelt confession of gratitude, maybe even love. She read it aloud on stage during Spirit Week, her voice mocking, her friends howling with laughter as Ethan's face burned red. Years later, Ethan found her running a boutique on the verge of collapse. He bought the property through a shell company, then offered her a partnership with generous terms. She signed eagerly. When the truth surfaced, that her business was now branded under Ward Enterprises, she cornered Ethan in the lobby of his headquarters. "Why would you do this?" she demanded. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't sneer. "You took something private and made it public," he said softly. "All I did was return the favor." Her boutique thrived under his ownership, but Melissa was reduced to a salaried employee in the store she once proudly called her own. Every receipt carried his name, a permanent reminder of the boy she had humiliated. And then there was Coach Turner. Authority figures sting the worst when they fail you. Ethan remembered one brutal afternoon, shoved into the mud during practice, the athletes jeering while Turner laughed and muttered, "Ward, toughen up. The world eats the weak." Ethan carried those words like a curse. 2 decades later, Turner applied for a grant from the Ethan Ward Foundation to fund an athletic program. He didn't realize the foundation belonged to his former student until his application was denied. The rejection letter bore Ethan's signature and a single sentence handwritten at the bottom. "The world does eat the weak. But I was never weak. I was patient." The humiliation spread through Milford like wildfire. Turner resigned the following year, his reputation shattered. Ethan's revenge reached its crescendo at the 20-year reunion. He didn't want to go, but part of him knew he needed to. Dressed in a tailored suit that whispered power, he arrived in a car that made heads turn. Conversations died as he entered. Faces froze. People who once mocked him now stumbled over their words, eager to shake his hand, desperate to prove they had never been one of the bad ones. Jason nursed a beer at the corner, his eyes hollow. Melissa tried to smile, but her hands shook. Turner didn't even show up. When Ethan was handed the microphone, the room held its breath. "In high school," he began, his voice steady, "I was taught what it means to be humiliated. I was taught what it means to be invisible. And I was taught that cruelty can shape you if you let it." He paused, scanning the faces, the ones who once laughed, now silent. "I let it shape me into this." He gestured subtly to the life he had built, the wealth, the influence, the empire. The silence was deafening. "But I want you to know something," he continued. His tone softened, but the weight of his words fell heavy. "Every laugh, every shove, every whisper, you thought you were breaking me. You weren't. You were building me." When he stepped down, he didn't stay for applause. He left the way he entered, untouchable. The echoes of that night followed everyone who had ever mocked him, lingering like a shadow. For Ethan, revenge wasn't fire or fury. It was transformation. He hadn't destroyed his enemies. He had simply risen, so high they couldn't even reach him anymore. And as he stood once more on his balcony that night, the city stretching endlessly before him, he whispered into the dark, "You thought you buried me, but you planted me."